The morning sun cast long shadows across the training ground at Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, California. Lieutenant Sarah Chen adjusted her tactical vest one final time before stepping onto the concrete pad that would serve as today's battlefield. Around her, dozens of elite military personnel from various branches prepared for what was being called the most challenging inter-service combat exercise of the year. Sarah had been looking forward to this day for months. As one of only a handful of female Navy SEALs in active service, she was accustomed to proving herself in environments where she was vastly outnumbered by male counterparts. Today's exercise would pit mixed teams against each other in close-quarters combat scenarios, testing everything from hand-to-hand combat skills to tactical decision-making under pressure. The exercise coordinator, Master Chief Rodriguez, stood before the assembled warriors with a clipboard in hand. His withered face bore the marks of decades of military service, and his voice carried the authority that came with having trained some of the most elite soldiers in the world. "Today's exercise will simulate urban warfare scenarios," Rodriguez announced, his voice cutting through the morning air. "You'll be facing multiple opponents in confined spaces, with limited visibility and unpredictable terrain. The goal is simple: neutralize all hostiles while protecting your assigned VIP." Sarah listened intently as Rodriguez outlined the rules of engagement. Each participant would be equipped with specialized training weapons that used compressed air and paint markers to simulate gunfire. Direct hits would register on electronic vests, effectively killing participants and removing them from the exercise. The scenarios would be timed, with performance metrics tracked by a sophisticated computer system that monitored everything from reaction times to tactical positioning. As the briefing concluded, Sarah noticed 4 soldiers from the Army's 75th Ranger Regiment huddled together near the equipment station. She recognized their type immediately: physically imposing, confidence bordering on arrogance, and clearly skeptical about having to work alongside anyone they perceived as less capable than themselves. The tallest of the group, Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, stood well over 6 feet with the kind of muscular build that came from years of intensive physical training. His eyes swept over Sarah with barely concealed dismissal. Beside him, Sergeant First Class Tony Ramirez cracked his knuckles while studying the training weapons with the familiarity of someone who had spent countless hours in similar exercises. The third member of their group, Sergeant Jake Morrison, was known throughout the base for his quick wit and equally quick temper. He had a reputation for pushing boundaries and testing limits, particularly when it came to female soldiers. The fourth, Corporal Devon Hayes, was the youngest of the group but had already distinguished himself in 2 combat deployments overseas. Sarah had encountered their type before: soldiers who believed that physical strength and aggression were the only qualities that mattered in combat. They looked at her petite 5'6" frame and saw vulnerability where she saw advantage. They focused on her gender where she focused on her capabilities. The first scenario was announced: a hostage rescue in a mock urban environment. The training facility had been constructed to replicate a Middle Eastern marketplace, complete with narrow alleyways, multi-story buildings, and countless hiding spots for both hostiles and civilians. As teams were randomly assigned, Sarah found herself paired with Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell, a seasoned Marine Corps officer who would serve as her VIP for the exercise. Mitchell was a veteran of multiple combat tours and had specifically requested to participate in today's training to evaluate inter-service cooperation protocols. "Ma'am," Mitchell said as they reviewed their mission brief together, "I've heard good things about SEAL training. Looking forward to seeing those skills in action." Sarah nodded respectfully. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." The 4 Rangers had been assigned as the primary threat team for their scenario. Their mission was simple: eliminate Sarah and capture Mitchell within a 15-minute time limit. The urban environment would provide them with multiple approach routes and tactical advantages. As Sarah studied the mock battlefield, she began forming her strategy. The Rangers would likely rely on their superior numbers and physical capabilities to overwhelm her through direct assault. They would expect her to take a defensive position and wait for backup that, in this scenario, would never come. Instead, Sarah planned to turn their expectations against them. The exercise began with Sarah and Mitchell positioned in a 3-story building that represented a safe house. Their objective was to extract to a designated landing zone while avoiding capture. Sarah had studied the building's layout extensively during the briefing period, noting every entrance, exit, and potential tactical position. Sir, we need to move, Sarah told Mitchell as they heard the exercise begin signal. They'll be expecting us to fortify this position, but our best chance is mobility. Mitchell followed as Sarah led him through a predetermined route she had memorized. Rather than taking the obvious path down the main staircase, she guided him through a series of maintenance corridors and service passages that most participants overlooked during their initial reconnaissance. The Rangers, meanwhile, had split into two teams as expected. Webb and Morrison took the front entrance while Ramirez and Hayes circled around to cover the rear exit. Their plan was textbook military tactics: establish a perimeter, close off escape routes, then systematically clear the building room by room. What they didn't account for was Sarah's intimate knowledge of unconventional warfare tactics. SEAL training emphasized adaptation and creative problem-solving over brute force approaches. While the Rangers focused on controlling the obvious routes, Sarah was already 3 moves ahead. She led Mitchell through a window on the second floor that connected to an adjacent building via a narrow fire escape. The route was physically demanding, requiring precise movements across unstable metal grating while maintaining noise discipline. For someone of Sarah's size and training, it was manageable. For most soldiers, it would have been considered too risky. As they crossed between buildings, Sarah heard the Rangers beginning their systematic search of the original structure. Their heavy footsteps and standard clearing procedures made them easy to track. She smiled slightly, knowing that within minutes they would discover the building was empty and realize they had been outmaneuvered. Mitchell was impressed by Sarah's tactical thinking. Outstanding work, Lieutenant. How did you know about this route? Reconnaissance is everything, sir, Sarah replied quietly. I spent the briefing period studying not just our building, but the entire complex. Most people focus on their immediate tactical situation. SEALs are trained to see the bigger picture. They made it to the adjacent building just as Sarah heard Webb's voice over the exercise communication system. Building 1 is clear. Target has vanished. The frustration in his voice was evident. Sarah knew the Rangers were now facing a psychological disadvantage. Their carefully planned assault had failed, and they were being forced to adapt to an unexpected situation. In her experience, soldiers who relied heavily on standard procedures often struggled when those procedures proved ineffective. From their new position, Sarah had multiple options. She could continue moving through the building complex, potentially reaching the extraction zone without further confrontation. Alternatively, she could use the Rangers' confusion to her advantage and go on the offensive. Sarah chose the latter approach. Sir, I need you to stay here and maintain radio silence, she told Mitchell. I'm going to neutralize the threat before we proceed to extraction. Mitchell raised an eyebrow. You're going after 4 Rangers by yourself? Sometimes the best defense is a good offense, Sarah replied. They're expecting to hunt us. They won't expect to become the hunted. Sarah moved through the building complex with the fluid grace that came from years of specialized training. Every movement was calculated to minimize noise and maximize tactical advantage. She had studied each of the Rangers during the briefing, noting their individual strengths, weaknesses, and preferred tactical approaches. Webb was the natural leader, decisive but sometimes inflexible in his thinking. Morrison was aggressive and direct, preferring close-quarters confrontation. Ramirez was methodical and patient, the most dangerous of the group in a prolonged engagement. Hayes was young and eager, which made him both unpredictable and prone to mistakes. Sarah's first target was Hayes, who had been assigned to watch the rear perimeter alone. She found him positioned behind a concrete barrier, focused intently on the building they had just evacuated. His attention was completely fixed on potential exit points from the structure, making him vulnerable to attack from behind. Moving with practiced silence, Sarah approached from his blind spot. In a real combat situation, this would have been a lethal encounter. In the training exercise, she simply placed her training weapon against his back and squeezed the trigger. The electronic vest registered the hit immediately. Hayes spun around in shock, his weapon raised but useless now that the computer system had registered him as eliminated. What the hell? Hayes whispered, staring at Sarah in disbelief. You're dead, Corporal, Sarah said simply. Better luck next time. 1 down, 3 to go. Sarah moved immediately to a new position, knowing that the other Rangers would soon discover Hayes had been eliminated. She had perhaps 2 minutes before they realized they were no longer the hunters in this scenario. Her next target was Morrison, who was advancing through the ground floor of the original building with characteristic aggression. Sarah positioned herself above him on the second floor, using a damaged section of flooring to observe his movement pattern. Morrison was thorough but impatient, clearing rooms quickly but without the methodical precision that characterized truly elite soldiers. When Morrison entered a room directly below her position, Sarah dropped through a ceiling panel that had been loosened during building construction. She landed behind him with cat-like silence, her training weapon aimed at his center mass before he could react. Morrison spun toward her, bringing his own weapon up, but Sarah had already fired. The electronic system registered another hit, and Morrison's vest lit up with indicators showing he had been eliminated. "Son of a bitch," Morrison muttered, lowering his weapon. "Where did you come from?" "Above," Sarah replied, already moving toward her next position. "Always check your overhead clearance." 2 down, 2 to go. The elimination of 2 team members in rapid succession had not gone unnoticed. Sarah heard Webb's voice over the communication system, his tone now carrying a note of respect mixed with frustration. "Ramirez, we have a problem. She's picked off Hayes and Morrison. This woman knows what she's doing." Sarah smiled at the acknowledgement. Webb was adapting his tactics, which made him more dangerous but also more predictable. Leaders under pressure often fell back on familiar patterns, and Sarah was counting on that tendency. She repositioned herself in the building complex's central courtyard, a space that provided multiple sightlines and escape routes. From here, she could observe the remaining Rangers' movements while maintaining tactical flexibility. Ramirez appeared first, moving with the careful precision that marked him as the most skilled of the 4. He had clearly recognized that they were facing an opponent who operated outside conventional parameters. His movements were deliberate and controlled, his weapon at ready position, his eyes constantly scanning for threats from unexpected angles. Webb emerged from a different approach route, demonstrating that they had learned from their earlier mistakes. They were now operating as a coordinated team, covering each other's movements and maintaining communication. Sarah waited, knowing that patience would serve her better than aggressive action. The Rangers were now operating in her environment, according to her timeline. Every second they spent searching for her was another second for her to study their patterns and identify weaknesses. The opportunity came when Ramirez moved to investigate a noise Sarah had deliberately created by disturbing a piece of loose debris. As he focused on the potential threat, Webb moved to provide covering fire from an elevated position. Their coordination was excellent, but it also meant they were both committed to specific positions. Sarah used a route they hadn't anticipated, crawling through a drainage tunnel that connected different sections of the training complex. She emerged behind Webb's position just as he was focused on covering Ramirez's approach to the noise disturbance. For the 3rd time in the exercise, Sarah had achieved complete tactical surprise. "Bang," she said softly, placing her training weapon against the back of Webb's head. Webb froze, then slowly lowered his weapon as his electronic vest registered the hit. He turned to look at Sarah with an expression of genuine respect. "Outstanding," he said simply. "I've never been outmaneuvered like that." Sarah nodded acknowledgement, but her attention was already focused on the final challenge. Ramirez had heard Webb's elimination and was now operating as a lone soldier in an environment where his opponent had demonstrated superior tactical awareness. This would be the most dangerous part of the exercise. Ramirez was skilled, experienced, and no longer burdened by the need to coordinate with teammates. He could move freely, take risks, and adapt instantly to changing circumstances. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Sarah knew it would test every skill she had developed during her years of SEAL training. The training complex fell silent except for the distant hum of observation equipment and the soft whisper of wind through the mock urban environment. Sarah knew that Ramirez was somewhere in the maze of buildings and alleyways, and unlike his eliminated teammates, he would not underestimate her again. She moved carefully through the shadows, her training weapon at the ready. The exercise had evolved beyond its original parameters. What had started as a straightforward extraction scenario had become a deadly game of cat and mouse between two highly skilled operatives. Ramirez had the advantage of desperation. With 3 teammates eliminated, he was fighting to salvage not just the mission but his unit's reputation. Sarah could hear the murmur of observers watching from the control room, their voices carrying across the exercise area. Word would spread quickly through the base about the female SEAL who had single-handedly neutralized 3 Rangers. Sarah found a position that offered good sightlines while keeping her hidden from most approaches. She needed to think like Ramirez now. He was methodical, patient, and had just witnessed his teammates fall to unconventional tactics. He would be expecting her to continue using surprise and misdirection. The smart play for Ramirez would be to change the game entirely. Instead of hunting her, he could focus on the original mission objective, capturing Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell. If Ramirez could reach Mitchell first, he could force Sarah into a position where her tactical advantages would be neutralized. Sarah cursed silently as she realized this possibility. She had left Mitchell in what she thought was a secure position, but Ramirez had been observing the entire engagement. He might have tracked their movement through the building complex and identified Mitchell's location. She activated her communication device, knowing that breaking radio silence was a risk but necessary under the circumstances. "Thunder, this is Lightning," she whispered, using their predetermined call signs. "Report status." Mitchell's voice came back immediately. "Lightning, Thunder here. Still in position, no contact. Thunder, you need to move. Take the eastern stairwell down 2 floors and wait for my signal. The remaining hostile may have tracked our route." "Copy, Lightning. Moving now." Sarah knew her communication had given away her general location to Ramirez, but protecting Mitchell was the primary mission objective. She began moving toward Mitchell's last known position, taking a circuitous route that would allow her to intercept any attempt to reach him. The building where Mitchell had been positioned was a 3-story structure designed to simulate a residential apartment complex. It had multiple entrances, interior stairwells, and numerous rooms that could provide either cover or concealment. Sarah approached from the south side, knowing that Ramirez would most likely attempt entry from the north or east based on his last known position. As she reached the building's perimeter, Sarah heard the soft sound of footsteps on concrete. Ramirez was moving, but his exact location was difficult to pinpoint due to the acoustic properties of the training complex. Sound bounced unpredictably between buildings, making it challenging to determine distance and direction. Sarah entered the building through a ground floor window that she had noted during her earlier reconnaissance. The interior was dimly lit, with artificial lighting designed to simulate the uncertain visibility conditions common in urban combat environments. She moved through the ground floor systematically, checking corners and potential hiding spots while listening for any indication of Ramirez's presence. The building was silent except for the distant sound of Mitchell moving through the eastern stairwell as she had instructed. On the 2nd floor, Sarah found evidence that Ramirez had been there recently. A loose piece of debris had been disturbed, and there were faint scuff marks on the dusty floor that indicated careful but rapid movement. Ramirez was indeed tracking toward Mitchell's original position. Sarah quickened her pace, knowing that time was working against her. If Ramirez reached Mitchell first, the mission would be compromised regardless of her earlier tactical successes. She reached the 3rd floor just as she heard movement in the eastern stairwell. Mitchell was following her instructions, but his movement was creating noise that would help Ramirez track his location. Sarah had to reach the stairwell before Ramirez could intercept Mitchell. Moving as quickly as silence would allow, Sarah navigated through the 3rd floor corridor toward the stairwell access. She could hear Mitchell's careful footsteps 2 floors below, and somewhere in between, she knew Ramirez was closing in. Sarah reached the stairwell just as she heard the distinctive sound of a door opening 1 floor below. Ramirez had entered the stairwell and was positioning himself between Sarah and Mitchell. The tactical situation had suddenly become much more complex. In the narrow confines of the stairwell, many of Sarah's advantages would be neutralized. There was limited room for maneuvering, fewer options for unconventional approaches, and the vertical nature of the space favored whoever controlled the high ground. Sarah had the high ground, but Ramirez was between her and her objective. She could hear Mitchell continuing his descent, unaware that an enemy operative was now in the same stairwell. "Thunder, freeze in place," Sarah whispered into her communication device. "Hostile in stairwell between us." Mitchell's footsteps stopped immediately. The stairwell fell silent, with 3 trained operatives separated by mere yards but unable to see each other due to the stairwell's construction. Sarah knew that this standoff favored Ramirez. He could wait for her to make the first move while maintaining his position between her and Mitchell. Every second that passed increased the likelihood that backup would arrive to assist him, even though no backup was actually coming in this exercise. Sarah needed to change the dynamic again. She activated her communication device, but this time she spoke loudly enough for Ramirez to hear. "Control, this is Lightning. Mission compromised. Initiating emergency extraction protocol." It was a bluff, but Sarah hoped it would force Ramirez to act before fictional reinforcements could arrive. She heard movement immediately as Ramirez began ascending the stairwell toward her position. Sarah smiled grimly. Ramirez was skilled, but he had just made the mistake of accepting her version of the tactical situation. There was no emergency extraction protocol, and no reinforcements were coming. He was moving because she had convinced him that time was working against him. As Ramirez climbed toward her position, Sarah quietly opened the stairwell door on her floor and moved into the corridor. She could track his progress by the sound of his footsteps on the metal stairs. When Ramirez reached her floor, he would find the stairwell empty. He would have to choose between continuing upward to search for her or descending to secure Mitchell. Either choice would give Sarah the opportunity she needed. Ramirez reached her floor and paused. Sarah could hear him breathing just beyond the stairwell door. He was thinking, evaluating his options, trying to anticipate her next move. The door opened slowly, and Ramirez emerged into the corridor with his weapon ready. He moved with the controlled precision of an expert, checking corners and maintaining situational awareness. Sarah was positioned above him, having climbed through a ceiling access panel that connected to the building's maintenance crawlspace. From her overhead position, she could observe Ramirez's movement without being detected. Ramirez moved through the corridor methodically, checking each room as he advanced. His technique was flawless, but Sarah had noted one consistent pattern: he always checked high corners last, focusing first on ground-level threats. It was a common training flaw that affected many soldiers. Urban combat instruction emphasized ground-level threats because they were statistically more likely in real combat situations. However, that emphasis sometimes created blind spots that skilled opponents could exploit. When Ramirez entered the room directly below her position, Sarah prepared to drop through the ceiling panel. This would be her best opportunity to end the engagement, but it was also the most dangerous. If Ramirez detected her movement, his superior position would give him the advantage. Sarah waited until Ramirez was fully committed to searching the room, then dropped through the panel with the silence that had made her previous eliminations possible. She landed behind him, her weapon aimed at his center mass. "Don't move," she said quietly. Ramirez froze, then slowly began to turn. "I said don't move," Sarah repeated, but Ramirez continued his turn, bringing his weapon around toward her position. The final confrontation happened in slow motion. Ramirez was faster than Sarah had anticipated, his weapon coming up with the speed that came from years of combat experience. Sarah fired first, but Ramirez's shot followed milliseconds later. Both electronic vests registered hits simultaneously. For a moment, neither soldier moved. Then, Ramirez lowered his weapon and smiled. "Mutual elimination," he said, extending his hand. "Hell of a fight, Lieutenant." Sarah shook his hand, feeling the respect that came from facing a truly skilled opponent. "You too, Sergeant." "That was closer than I liked." The exercise control room's voice came over the communication system: "All participants, exercise terminated. Report to debriefing room for after-action review." As Sarah and Ramirez made their way to collect Mitchell and join the debriefing, word of the engagement was already spreading through the base. A female SEAL had eliminated 3 Rangers and fought the 4th to a draw in a scenario where she had been outnumbered 4-1. The debriefing room was packed with observers, instructors, and participants from other exercises who had heard about the unusual outcome. Master Chief Rodriguez stood at the front of the room with an expression that mixed surprise with professional interest. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rodriguez began, "we've just witnessed one of the most unconventional exercise outcomes in recent memory. Lieutenant Chen, would you walk us through your tactical decision-making process?" Sarah stood and addressed the room, knowing that every word would be analyzed and discussed for months to come. This was more than just an exercise debrief. It was an opportunity to demonstrate that unconventional thinking could overcome conventional advantages. The key was recognizing that the opposition expected me to play defense, Sarah began. They had superior numbers and positioned themselves accordingly. By taking the initiative and going on the offensive, I was able to engage them individually rather than as a coordinated unit. Webb, who had been eliminated first among the Rangers, raised his hand. "Lieutenant, what made you think you could take on 4 Rangers in direct combat?" Sarah smiled at the question. "I wasn't planning to take you on in direct combat, Staff Sergeant. I was planning to avoid direct combat entirely by controlling the terms of engagement." The room buzzed with conversation as participants discussed the tactical implications of Sarah's approach. She had demonstrated that superior firepower and numbers could be neutralized by superior strategy and execution. Morrison, the second Ranger to be eliminated, spoke up. "Ma'am, I have to admit, when I first saw you in the briefing, I didn't think you had what it takes for this kind of exercise." "I was wrong." Sarah nodded acknowledgement. "Sergeant, that's exactly the kind of assumption I was counting on. When opponents underestimate you, they make mistakes. Those mistakes create opportunities." Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, who had observed the entire engagement from his position in the stairwell, added his perspective. "What impressed me most was Lieutenant Chen's ability to adapt her strategy in real time. When she realized that Ramirez was targeting me, she immediately changed her approach to protect the mission objective." The debriefing continued for over an hour, with participants and observers analyzing every aspect of the engagement. Sarah answered questions about her training, her tactical philosophy, and her approach to problem-solving under pressure. As the session concluded, Rodriguez made an announcement that surprised everyone in the room. "Based on today's exercise, I'm recommending that Lieutenant Chen be invited to participate in the Advanced Inter-Service Combat Instructor Program. Her performance today demonstrates exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need to incorporate into our training protocols." The room erupted in applause, with even the Rangers joining in. Webb approached Sarah as participants began to file out of the debriefing room. "Lieutenant," he said, "I owe you an apology. When I saw you this morning, I made assumptions based on your size and gender. You've shown me that combat effectiveness isn't about physical appearance." Sarah shook his hand. "Staff Sergeant, we all make assumptions. The key is being willing to learn from them." Ramirez joined the conversation, adding his own perspective. "Ma'am, I've been in combat situations where that kind of tactical thinking would have saved lives. I hope you'll consider sharing some of your approaches with other units." Sarah nodded. "I'd be honored to, Sergeant. We all have something to learn from each other." As the participants dispersed, Sarah reflected on the day's events. The exercise had started as a routine training scenario but had evolved into something much more significant. She had not only demonstrated her own capabilities but had also challenged assumptions about gender, size, and conventional tactical approaches. The 4 Rangers who had boxed her in at the beginning of the exercise now understood why she was a Navy SEAL. It wasn't just about physical capabilities or weapons training. It was about the ability to think creatively under pressure, to turn disadvantages into advantages, and to never accept that a situation was hopeless. More importantly, the exercise had demonstrated that diversity in military units wasn't just about fairness or representation. It was about bringing different perspectives and approaches to complex tactical problems. Sarah's unconventional thinking had been the key to her success, and that thinking had been shaped by her unique experiences and background. As Sarah headed back to her quarters to write her after-action report, she knew that today would be remembered as a turning point. Not just for her own career, but for the broader conversation about the role of women in special operations units. The exercise had proven that when it came to tactical excellence, assumptions based on physical appearance could be not just wrong but dangerously misleading. In the world of special operations, the most important weapon was the mind, and Sarah had demonstrated that her mind was as sharp as any warrior's on the base. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove herself, but today had been a victory in ways that extended far beyond the boundaries of a training exercise. The 4 soldiers who had boxed her in had learned a valuable lesson about the nature of true strength, and that lesson would stay with them for the rest of their military careers. 3 months after the legendary training exercise, Sarah Chen found herself in an environment far removed from the controlled conditions of the Coronado training facility. She was embedded with a joint task force operating in the mountains of Afghanistan, where her unconventional tactical approach would face its ultimate test in real combat conditions. The mission briefing took place in a reinforced bunker at Forward Operating Base Falcon, where representatives from multiple military branches had gathered to plan what intelligence officers were calling the most critical operation in the region in over 2 years. Colonel Patricia Hayes, the task force commander, stood before a detailed topographical map as she outlined the situation. "Gentlemen and lady," she began, nodding toward Sarah, "we have confirmed intelligence that a high-value target known as the Engineer is operating from a compound approximately 15 kilometers northeast of our current position. The Engineer was responsible for designing the improvised explosive devices that had killed dozens of coalition forces over the past 6 months. His capture or elimination was considered essential to disrupting the enemy's operational capabilities in the region." Sarah studied the satellite imagery that accompanied the briefing. The target compound was situated in a narrow valley surrounded by steep mountain ridges. It was a natural fortress that provided excellent defensive positions while limiting approach routes for attacking forces. "The compound is heavily defended," Colonel Hayes continued. "We estimate between 20 and 30 combatants, armed with automatic weapons, rocket-propelled grenades, and prepared fighting positions. They've been fortifying this location for months." Staff Sergeant Webb, who had been assigned to the same task force following his impressive performance in subsequent training exercises, raised his hand. "Ma'am, what's our approach route?" "That valley looks like a perfect kill zone." Sarah had been wondering the same thing. The satellite imagery showed that any conventional assault would require forces to advance through open terrain under direct fire from elevated positions. It was exactly the kind of scenario where superior numbers and firepower would favor the defenders. Colonel Hayes activated a laser pointer and indicated several positions on the map. "Air support will conduct preliminary bombardment of known defensive positions at 0400 hours. Ground assault will commence 30 minutes later, with Alpha Team approaching from the north while Bravo Team provides covering fire from the western ridge." Sarah studied the plan with growing concern. It was a conventional military approach that relied on overwhelming firepower to neutralize defensive advantages. While such tactics often succeeded, they also typically resulted in significant casualties among attacking forces. More troubling was the likelihood that the Engineer would escape during the initial bombardment. High-value targets rarely remained in exposed positions when under attack, and the compound undoubtedly had prepared escape routes that would allow key personnel to evacuate before ground forces could arrive. "Colonel," Sarah said, raising her hand, "has consideration been given to alternative approach routes?" Hayes looked at her with interest. "What did you have in mind, Lieutenant?" Sarah approached the map and studied the topographical details more carefully. "The plan assumes that we need to attack the compound directly, but our primary objective is capturing the Engineer. If we can identify his likely escape route, we might be able to intercept him during the confusion of the main assault." The room fell silent as other participants considered Sarah's suggestion. It was exactly the kind of unconventional thinking that had distinguished her during training exercises, but applying such concepts in actual combat carried risks that training scenarios could not replicate. Major Thompson, the task force's intelligence officer, activated a different set of satellite images. "Lieutenant Chen raises an interesting point. Our surveillance has identified several possible egress routes from the compound. The most likely leads through a series of mountain paths toward the Pakistani border." Sarah studied the new imagery, noting the terrain features that would influence movement patterns. "If the Engineer follows that route, there are several natural choke points where a small team could position itself for intercept. We wouldn't need to assault the compound directly. Webb, who had developed considerable respect for Sarah's tactical abilities, added his perspective. "It's worth considering, ma'am. A diversionary assault combined with an intercept operation could give us better odds of mission success." Colonel Hayes studied the map for several minutes before making her decision. "Lieutenant Chen, you'll lead a 4-person team positioned along the primary escape route. Your mission is to intercept and capture the engineer if he attempts to evacuate during the main assault." Sarah nodded, already beginning to formulate her plan. "Yes, ma'am. I'll need team members who are comfortable with unconventional operations." "Take your pick from available personnel," Hayes replied. "You've got 48 hours to prepare." Sarah's first choice was obvious. Despite their initial confrontation during training, Webb had proven himself to be adaptable and skilled in unconventional operations. His physical capabilities would be valuable in the mountainous terrain they would be operating in. Her second choice was Sergeant First Class Maria Santos, a Marine Force reconnaissance specialist who had recently joined the task force. Santos had a reputation for precise marksmanship and calm decision-making under pressure. The third team member was Corporal David Kim, an Air Force pararescue specialist whose medical training and climbing expertise made him ideal for mountain operations. Kim had participated in several high-altitude rescue missions and was comfortable operating in challenging terrain. The team spent the next day studying satellite imagery, weather reports, and intelligence assessments of enemy capabilities. Sarah's plan was to position the team along the most likely escape route approximately 6 hours before the main assault began, giving them time to establish concealed positions and prepare for a potential intercept operation. The night before the mission, Sarah found herself reviewing the plan one final time when Webb approached her position. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, "I wanted to thank you for including me on this team." Sarah looked up from her maps. "You've earned it, Staff Sergeant. Besides, I need someone I can count on when things get complicated." Webb smiled. "After that training exercise, I learned not to underestimate your ability to handle complications." The conversation was interrupted by Santos and Kim, who joined them for a final equipment check. Each team member carried specialized gear suited to their role in the operation. Sarah had her standard SEAL equipment plus additional climbing gear for mountain operations. Webb carried extra ammunition and explosive charges for creating diversions if needed. Santos had her sniper rifle and extended-range optics for surveillance and precision fire. Kim brought medical supplies and technical climbing equipment. At 0200 hours, the team departed the forward operating base using a route that would take them into the mountains without alerting enemy surveillance. They traveled on foot through terrain that would challenge even experienced mountain climbers. Sarah led the team along paths that existed more as suggestions than actual trails, using night vision equipment to navigate through darkness that would have been impenetrable to the naked eye. The altitude and steep terrain made every step demanding, but the team maintained their pace without complaint. After 4 hours of climbing, they reached the position Sarah had selected for their intercept operation. It was a natural bottleneck between two mountain ridges where any escape route would be forced to pass through a narrow valley approximately 50 meters wide. The team established concealed positions that provided excellent observation of the approach routes while remaining hidden from casual surveillance. Santos positioned herself on the eastern ridge with her sniper rifle, covering the longest sight lines. Webb and Kim took positions on the western side, where they could provide suppression fire and close-quarters engagement if needed. Sarah positioned herself in the valley floor, where she could coordinate the team's actions and respond rapidly to changing tactical situations. At 0400 hours, the distant sound of aircraft engines announced the beginning of the main assault. Sarah could see flashes of explosions on the horizon as air support engaged the target compound. The bombardment continued for 20 minutes, filling the mountain air with the rumble of high-explosive munitions. Sarah activated her communication system and checked in with each team member. "All positions report status." "Santos in position, good visibility, no movement detected," came the first response. "Webb in position, ready for action," followed immediately. "Kim in position, medical standing by," completed the check-in. At 0430 hours, the sounds of ground combat began as the main assault teams engaged remaining defenders at the compound. Sarah could hear the distinctive sounds of automatic weapons fire and explosive charges as coalition forces fought their way through prepared defensive positions. The main assault was proceeding according to plan, but Sarah knew that their success depended on the engineer's reaction to the attack. If he chose to remain in the compound and fight, their intercept mission would be unnecessary. If he attempted to escape, the next few hours would determine the mission's ultimate success or failure. At 0445 hours, Santos reported movement through her rifle scope. I have visual on 3 individuals moving northeast along the ridge trail. Range approximately 800 meters and closing. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as adrenaline began flowing. After hours of preparation and positioning, the actual mission was beginning. Can you identify the engineer? Negative, insufficient detail at this range. But the movement pattern suggests they're trying to avoid detection. Sarah coordinated her team's response. Santos, continue surveillance and report any changes. Webb and Kim, prepare for intercept action. I'm moving to blocking position. The terrain that Sarah had selected for their operation now proved its value. The 3 individuals approaching their position would be forced to pass through the narrow valley, where the team could engage them with overwhelming tactical advantage. As the figures drew closer, Santos provided updated reports on their movement. 3 males, armed with automatic weapons, moving carefully but not using proper tactical dispersal. They appear to be prioritizing speed over security. Webb's voice came over the communication system. Lieutenant, if they maintain current pace, they'll reach our position in approximately 10 minutes. Sarah confirmed her own position and verified that all team members were ready for action. Remember, our primary objective is capture, not elimination. We need the engineer alive for interrogation. The approaching figures were now close enough for Sarah to observe through her own optics. The lead individual appeared to be older than his companions and carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to command. His clothing was distinctly different from the typical combat gear worn by ordinary fighters, suggesting that he might indeed be their high-value target. At 0455 hours, the 3 men reached the narrow valley where Sarah's team was positioned. They were moving single file along a path that would take them directly through the intercept zone. Sarah made the decision to initiate contact. Execute intercept operation. Santos, be ready for suppression fire if needed. Webb and Kim moved to blocking positions. The 3 men were caught completely by surprise as the coalition team emerged from concealed positions with weapons trained on them. Sarah stepped into the path directly in front of the lead figure while Webb and Kim positioned themselves to prevent any escape attempt. Drop your weapons and get on the ground, Sarah commanded in clear Arabic, a language she had studied extensively during her pre-deployment training. The lead figure looked around desperately, realizing that escape was impossible. His 2 companions immediately dropped their weapons and complied with Sarah's commands, but the lead figure hesitated. You are surrounded, Sarah continued. Surrender now and you will not be harmed. For a moment, the situation balanced on the edge of violence. The lead figure's hand moved toward the pistol on his belt, while his eyes calculated the odds of fighting his way out of the ambush. Webb's voice cut through the tension. Don't do it. You're outnumbered and outgunned. Make the smart choice. The lead figure's shoulders sagged as he realized the futility of resistance. He slowly removed his pistol and placed it on the ground, then raised his hands above his head. Kim quickly moved to secure all 3 prisoners while Santos maintained overwatch from her position on the ridge. Within minutes, the intercept operation was complete. Sarah examined the lead prisoner more closely, comparing his features to the intelligence photographs she had memorized. The facial structure, age, and distinctive scar above his left eye all matched the target description. Webb, I believe we have our man, Sarah reported. The engineer is in custody. As the team prepared to extract their prisoners to the forward operating base, Sarah reflected on how the mission had succeeded because of the same unconventional thinking that had distinguished her during training exercises. Rather than focusing on the heavily defended compound, they had identified the target's likely behavior and positioned themselves accordingly. The main assault had succeeded in destroying the compound and eliminating remaining combatants, but the most valuable outcome was the capture of the engineer himself. His intelligence value was immeasurable, potentially leading to the disruption of bomb-making operations throughout the region. As they began the journey back to base, Webb approached Sarah with an expression of genuine admiration. "Lieutenant, once again you've demonstrated that thinking differently can make all the difference. That intercept operation probably saved a lot of lives on both sides." Sarah nodded, knowing that today's success would be studied and replicated in future operations. The principles she had applied during training exercises had proven equally effective in actual combat, validating her approach to unconventional warfare. The mission had also demonstrated that diversity in special operations teams provided tactical advantages that extended far beyond political considerations. Sarah's different perspective and approach had identified opportunities that conventional thinking might have missed. As the team made their way through the mountain terrain with their high-value prisoner, Sarah knew that this operation would be remembered as a significant success. But, more importantly, it had proven that the lessons learned during that training exercise months earlier had real applications in the field of combat operations. 2 years had passed since the successful capture of the engineer, and Lieutenant Saracen found herself standing before a packed auditorium at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. She had been invited to deliver the keynote address at the annual Special Operations Symposium, where military leaders from around the world gathered to discuss the future of unconventional warfare. The invitation itself was remarkable. At 32 years old, Sarah had become one of the most respected tactical instructors in the special operations community. Her innovative approaches to small unit tactics had been incorporated into training programs across all service branches, and her successful field operations had earned her recognition at the highest levels of military command. As Sarah looked out at the audience, she recognized many faces from her years of service. Colonel Hayes, who had commanded her task force in Afghanistan, sat in the front row. Master Chief Rodriguez, now retired but still influential in military training circles, smiled encouragingly from the second row. Most significantly, the 4 Rangers who had participated in that memorable training exercise were scattered throughout the auditorium, each having risen in rank and responsibility since their encounter with Sarah's unconventional tactics. Staff Sergeant Webb, now a Master Sergeant and senior instructor at the Army's Ranger School, had specifically requested permission to attend the symposium. The lessons he had learned from Sarah's approach had fundamentally changed how he taught small unit tactics to new generations of Rangers. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the sophisticated sound system, "I want to start by taking you back to a training exercise that occurred 3 years ago at Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, California." The audience listened intently as Sarah described the scenario where 4 Rangers had been assigned to neutralize her during a hostage rescue simulation. She explained how their initial assumptions about her capabilities had influenced their tactical planning, and how those assumptions had created opportunities for unconventional approaches. "The lesson that day wasn't about gender or physical capability," Sarah continued. "It was about the danger of accepting conventional thinking as the only valid approach to tactical problems. When we limit ourselves to standard procedures, we become predictable. When we become predictable, we become vulnerable." Sarah activated a presentation system that displayed tactical diagrams on screens throughout the auditorium. She walked through each phase of that original training exercise, explaining her decision-making process and the principles that had guided her actions. "The key insight was recognizing that I didn't need to defeat 4 opponents simultaneously," she explained. "I needed to create conditions where I could engage them individually, on terms that favored my capabilities over theirs." Master Sergeant Webb, watching from the audience, remembered the shock of discovering that Sarah had eliminated Hayes and Morrison before he and Ramirez had even realized they were under attack. The experience had forced him to fundamentally reconsider his understanding of tactical planning and execution. Sarah's presentation moved beyond the training exercise to discuss how similar principles had been applied in actual combat operations. She described the mission to capture the engineer, explaining how conventional assault plans had been supplemented with an unconventional intercept operation that ultimately determined the mission's success. "In Afghanistan, we faced a choice between accepting the tactical situation as it appeared or looking for alternatives that others might overlook," Sarah said. "By focusing on the target's probable behavior rather than his fixed position, we were able to achieve mission success with minimal casualties. The audience, composed primarily of senior military officers and tactical instructors, understood the significance of what Sarah was describing. She was advocating for a fundamental shift in how Special Operations Forces approach tactical planning and execution. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, who had served as Sarah's VIP during the original training exercise and was now a full colonel commanding a Special Operations unit, raised his hand during the question and answer period. "Lieutenant Commander Chen," he said, using Sarah's new rank, "how do we institutionalize this kind of creative thinking without compromising the discipline and standardization that are essential to military effectiveness?" It was an excellent question that got to the heart of military education and training philosophy. Sarah had anticipated it and had developed a comprehensive response based on her experiences as both a practitioner and instructor of unconventional tactics. "Colonel, I believe the key is distinguishing between foundational principles and tactical applications," Sarah replied. "Military discipline, physical fitness, weapons proficiency, and team coordination are foundational elements that must be standardized and rigorously maintained. However, the application of these capabilities to specific tactical situations should encourage innovation and adaptation." Sarah elaborated on her approach to training, which emphasized teaching students to think critically about tactical problems rather than simply memorizing predetermined solutions. She had developed exercises that deliberately presented scenarios where conventional approaches would fail, forcing students to develop creative alternatives. "We need to train warriors who can think as well as fight," Sarah explained. "Technology and tactics are constantly evolving, but the ability to analyze problems, adapt to changing circumstances, and develop innovative solutions will always be relevant." The symposium continued for 3 days, with Sarah participating in panel discussions, tactical workshops, and planning sessions for future military education initiatives. Her influence on special operations doctrine was evident in every conversation and presentation. On the final evening of the symposium, a reception was held to honor distinguished participants and retiring military leaders. Sarah found herself surrounded by officers who wanted to discuss her ideas and share their own experiences with unconventional operations. Master Sergeant Webb approached her during the reception, accompanied by Sergeants First Class Morrison and Ramirez, both of whom had been promoted since their encounter with Sarah 3 years earlier. "Lieutenant Commander," Webb said with a smile, "we wanted to thank you for the lessons you taught us that day at Coronado. Those lessons have made us better soldiers and better instructors." Morrison nodded in agreement. "Ma'am, I have to admit that experience was humbling, but it was also one of the most valuable learning opportunities of my career. I've incorporated your approaches into my own training methods." Ramirez, who had fought Sarah to a draw in their final confrontation, added his perspective. "Lieutenant Commander, what impressed me most was your ability to turn our strengths against us. You made us realize that confidence without adaptability can become a weakness." Sarah appreciated their recognition, but she also wanted to emphasize the broader implications of that training exercise. "Gentlemen, the real lesson wasn't about any individual technique or tactic. It was about the importance of diverse perspectives and approaches in solving complex problems." The conversation expanded as other officers joined the discussion, sharing their own experiences with unconventional operations and innovative tactical approaches. Sarah realized that the training exercise at Coronado had sparked a broader conversation about military doctrine and the value of creative thinking in special operations. Colonel Hayes, now a brigadier general, joined the group with news that Sarah had been selected for a prestigious assignment. "Lieutenant Commander Chen, you've been chosen to head a new joint task force that will develop innovative training methodologies for special operations forces across all service branches." The assignment represented the culmination of everything Sarah had worked toward since that memorable training exercise. She would have the opportunity to influence how future generations of special operations personnel were trained and how they approached tactical problem solving. "General, I'm honored by the assignment," Sarah replied. "I believe we have an opportunity to fundamentally improve how we prepare warriors for the challenges they'll face in the field." As the reception continued, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The training exercise where 4 soldiers had boxed her in had been a catalyst for changes that extended far beyond her own career. The principles she had demonstrated that day had influenced training programs, tactical doctrine, and operational planning throughout the special operations community. More significantly, the exercise had demonstrated the value of diversity in military units. Sarah's different perspective and unconventional approach had provided capabilities that complemented rather than replaced traditional military strengths. Her success had opened doors for other women in special operations and had challenged assumptions about gender roles in combat units. Master Chief Rodriguez, now in his 80s but still sharp and engaged, approached Sarah as the evening was concluding. "Lieutenant Commander," he said with the voice of someone who had trained thousands of warriors over his long career, "I wanted to tell you that I've never seen a training exercise have such a lasting impact on how we think about tactical operations." Sarah smiled at the recognition from someone whose opinion she valued enormously. "Master Chief, that exercise taught me as much as it taught anyone else. It showed me that the most important battles are often won before the first shot is fired." Rodriguez nodded knowingly. "That's wisdom that takes most warriors decades to learn. You figured it out in your 20s. As the symposium concluded and participants prepared to return to their respective commands, Sarah knew that the work ahead would be challenging. Changing institutional culture and established training methodologies would require patience, persistence, and political skill in addition to tactical expertise. However, she also knew that the principles she advocated had been proven in both training and combat environments. The success of unconventional approaches in actual operations provided compelling evidence for their broader adoption throughout the military. The 4 soldiers who had boxed her in during that training exercise had become advocates for her approach, helping to spread innovative tactical thinking throughout their respective units and commands. Their initial skepticism had been transformed into enthusiastic support, demonstrating that even experienced warriors could benefit from exposure to different perspectives and methodologies. As Sarah boarded her flight back to her new assignment, she thought about the young warriors who would soon be entering special operations training programs. They would face challenges that previous generations could never have imagined, operating in environments where technological superiority and overwhelming firepower might not guarantee success. These future warriors would need the same foundational skills that had always characterized elite military units: physical fitness, weapons proficiency, tactical discipline, and unshakable dedication to mission accomplishment. However, they would also need something more: the ability to think creatively, adapt rapidly to changing circumstances, and develop innovative solutions to unprecedented problems. The training exercise at Coronado had been a small-scale demonstration of these principles. Sarah's new assignment would give her the opportunity to influence how thousands of warriors were prepared for the challenges they would face in defending their nations and protecting their fellow citizens. The 4 soldiers who had boxed her in that day had learned a valuable lesson about the nature of tactical thinking and the importance of avoiding assumptions. More importantly, they had become teachers themselves, sharing those lessons with new generations of warriors who would carry these principles forward into whatever conflicts awaited them. Sarah smiled as her aircraft lifted off from Newport, knowing that the most important battle she had ever fought had been won not with weapons or physical strength, but with intelligence, creativity, and the courage to challenge conventional thinking. That victory would continue to pay dividends for years to come, as warriors trained according to her principles faced real enemies in actual combat situations around the world. The story that had begun with 4 soldiers boxing in a female SEAL during a training exercise had become a legend that would influence military doctrine for decades. But, more than that, it had proven that the most powerful weapons in any warrior's arsenal were adaptability, innovation, and the wisdom to know that there was always more than one way to accomplish a mission. In the end, the 4 soldiers hadn't just learned why Sarah was a SEAL. They had learned what it truly meant to be an elite warrior in an age where victory would belong to those who could think as effectively as they could fight.